Have you ever wondered why a brand labeled as for old people like Buick still survived GM's major surgery in 2009, while Pontiac, a symbol of excitement, exhaust notes, and names that make car lovers' hearts beat faster, was shut down? The common answer everyone brings up is because Buick sells extremely well in China. It sounds reasonable. It sounds neat. It sounds like an immortal stamp some slapped right onto Buick's hood. But I don't believe that reason. If you think China is Buick's only life-saving card, you're mistaken. Because this isn't just about where the cars sell, but about the technical structure, the positioning equation, and the way a conglomerate like GM weighs its names so they overlap as little as possible, are the easiest to pivot and are the cheapest to maintain. And in this video, I will explain the real reason why Buick stayed, while Pontiac and Oldsmobile had to go in a way that runs counter to the traditional belief most people have long held. When people say Buick survived thanks to China, it sounds like an all-too-convenient conclusion. It satisfies the feeling that one massive market is enough to save an entire brand. But if you look at how a conglomerate like GM operates, you'll see the key point isn't where it sells well, but whether it's necessary to keep that brand's shell intact in the US or not. First, put it in the proper historical context. From the 1980s to the 1990s and into the 2000s, GM entered a period of brand explosion, like a massive parking lot, where every corner suddenly sprouted a new sign. Geo, Hummer, Saturn. Each name represented an experiment, a dream, a slice of the market. But when the crisis hit and GM fell into bankruptcy, everything turned ruthless. They had to cut back, slim down, and clean up the portfolio. And so, Hummer, Saturn, Pontiac, Oldsmobile shut down one by one. Now comes the important part. A brand, when you get right down to it, is mostly a name and a logo. A vehicle model can absolutely swap badges to be reborn under a different brand if the corporation wants. In fact, GM has done that many times and done it very naturally. The clearest example is the 2011 to 2017 Buick Regal. At its core, it was a German Opel simply redressed as a Buick to be sold in the US market. The platform, the technical structure, the driving character all carried a European flavor. But once it passed through a layer of branding and positioning, it became a Buick in buyers' eyes. And with Buick's SUV models from 2018 to 2020, the story becomes even clearer. Many of them have technical underpinnings extremely close to Chevrolet vehicles within the same corporation. In fact, there are models where you can look at them and immediately recognize the close family resemblance. Same skeleton, different outfit. A commonly cited case is a Buick SUV, whose roots are very close to the Chevrolet Trax. While the Trax in turn is tied to development and production in South Korea, meaning the vehicle wears a Buick badge, but the platform origins and supply chain are not purely American in the way people imagine. These examples bring us back to the core point. This is global homogenization in the auto industry. A chassis, a powertrain, a technical platform can travel across many markets and many brands, changing only the badge, the equipment, the interior materials, and the positioning story. Once you have a global structure like that, GM doesn't need to keep an intact American Buick just to sustain a Chinese Buick. GM holds the rights to the brand, the authority to decide products, and the ability to manufacture by region. They can absolutely sell a vehicle in China under the Buick name. And if they want to sell a similar vehicle in the US, they can place it under another name within the GM system. For example, a premiumized Chevrolet model or a repositioned product line. In other words, the dependency between Buick in the US and Buick in China is far looser than most people think. China may be an important market, but it isn't a lifeline that must be kept connected by ensuring Buick exists as a strong brand in the US. When you set aside the China factor as an overly easy answer, the next question immediately pops up. So, why didn't GM keep Oldsmobile? On paper, Oldsmobile used to be a fairly sensible near-luxury brand, even at times a bit sportier than Buick, with a name familiar to Americans. And if GM needed a badge to sit between Chevrolet and Cadillac, Oldsmobile seemed like it could absolutely fill that role. But the problem is, a brand doesn't survive on seeming reasonable. It survives on sales, on the image in customers' minds, and on whether it can create a clear gap from its siblings within the same house. The first reason, the most straightforward: sales. Even though Oldsmobile had certain model years praised as beautiful with a character of their own, the market didn't pay for that beauty long enough. When GM had to cut, they couldn't keep a name whose sales curve didn't prove its vitality, especially at a time when every dollar of cost was scrutinized like an oil stain under the chassis. The second reason, and also the hardest psychological knife to pull out: the name. In a world that worships youthfulness, the word old in Oldsmobile is like a sign hung around its own neck. I belong to the past. You can refresh the design. You can swap the engine. You can upgrade the interior. But it's very hard to persuade a new generation of customers to love a name that from the very start already suggests something outdated. Imagine Apple launching an iPhone called iPhone Antique. Would you buy it? And that's what left Oldsmobile boxed in. It wasn't luxurious enough to stand alongside Cadillac. And it also wasn't cheap and mass-market enough to sit next to Chevrolet. In a brand portfolio, a name that's squeezed like that can easily become redundant, because any product Oldsmobile makes risks stepping on Chevrolet below or bumping into Cadillac above. When you have to streamline, you cut the links that don't create a clear boundary. And I know that at this point, many of you will feel a sense of regret. To be blunt, Pontiac isn't the brand I love most. But I understand the feeling when you hear a name like GTO or Firebird. It's not just a car, it's an era. Pontiac GTO Firebird. Legends tied to engine sound, the smell of gasoline, and long roads. But try just once to set your heart aside. Put yourself in the seat of a CEO staring at the balance sheet and ask a cold question. If I keep Pontiac, what do I gain and what do I lose? Before it was shut down, Pontiac wasn't a dead car sitting still. Their sales at the time were still fairly solid, around 240,000 vehicles per year. And more importantly, they didn't sit still and wait to die. Pontiac tried very different turns. Pontiac Aztek was the most controversial gamble, an angular-looking crossover that broke the design standards of its time, aimed at people who love adventure, camping, and the outdoors. It had plenty of practical ideas in terms of space and everyday usability, but the design was so unusual that it became more of a controversial symbol than a sales boost. Pontiac Solstice was a love letter to those who live for driving feel. A two-seat roadster, low-slung, soft top, prioritizing fun behind the wheel over family convenience. And Pontiac GTO was a direct strike at performance nostalgia. A V8 coupe aimed at American-style torque and acceleration, but it borrowed its platform from Australia. So, the chassis feel and solidity carried a different character. In theory, Pontiac could absolutely have become GM's high-performance division at a reasonable price point, a direct counter to Dodge, sitting below Cadillac and above Chevrolet. That's a beautiful dream. And it also sounds perfectly aligned with Pontiac's reputation. But the problem is, to turn that dream into a product, GM would have had to pay a price they didn't want to pay in 2009. The first issue was the SUV trend. The world in 2009 was shifting very quickly toward SUVs and crossovers. And Pontiac was a brand of sporty sedans and coues, of low stances, of driving feel. You can force an SUV with a Pontiac badge onto the road, but the DNA doesn't support it, and customers aren't sure what they'd be buying it for. Some luxury brands can build SUVs and still keep their identity because their brand foundation is strong enough to turn the story. But Pontiac at that time didn't have that privilege. The second issue was a supply chain nightmare. Pontiac at the time relied quite heavily on global platforms and products, especially those good deals on underpinnings coming from GM's international branches. When GM contracted, sold off, or pulled back from key operations overseas, the flow of reasonably priced platforms for Pontiac to borrow and build sporty cars was choked off. But the third issue was the decisive knife. And this is the most valuable new idea: the risk of stepping on each other internally, meaning a sales risk to GM itself. If GM wanted to keep Pontiac as a high-performance badge, Pontiac needed a rear-wheel drive platform to build proper sedans and coues. And at that time, the most premium and ready rear-wheel drive platform within GM belonged to Cadillac. And here's the thorny equation. If you take Cadillac's good chassis, simplify it, cheapen it, then sell it under the Pontiac badge to attack a lower price segment, you will personally make customers turn their backs on Cadillac because buyers aren't blind. They will ask, "Why should I pay extra for a Cadillac when Pontiac gives me a nearly similar experience?" While Cadillac is the golden goose for profit and image. And because of that, Pontiac fell into a no-way-out trap. If Pontiac wanted to be truly different, it would cost money to have its own platform, products, and identity. But if it shared a premium platform to save money, Pontiac would directly threaten Cadillac. In a crisis, GM didn't choose the expensive option, and it also didn't accept the option of weakening a high-profit brand. And now, we return to the main character. Why, in the end, was Buick GM's most sensible choice? The first thing to say, plainly, Buick has been repositioned. Buick today is no longer the image of a long sedan, soft like a sofa meant for people who only need smoothness and quiet. GM understood that if Buick kept that exact old feel, it would box itself into a dead end. So, they pulled Buick out of its old coat, made it more modern, more tidy, and most importantly, more neutral. A near luxury type that's easy to accept the way many people view Acura or Lexus. Not too flashy, but polite enough to step up a level from mainstream cars.